Welcome back to another dive into Helldivers 2. If you watch my last video of Helldivers 2, I've talked about the Ryzen 5 1500X being a bottleneck for the GTX 1050 Ti. Normally when dev posts the minimum requirement to play a game, they stay conservative and they put specs that will make the game playable on lower end. This time, it's not enough. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk. Let's hell dive in. I first kept the same setup, the Ryzen 5 1500X, 8GB of RAM, but I upgraded the GTX 1050 Ti to the GTX 1060 6GB. I let the settings at 1080p, medium, and the render at balance, and I reached a bare 39 FPS, only 4 FPS better than the 1050 Ti, which was played at low settings. We have a CPU and RAM bottleneck. Then I upgrade again the GPU without changing anything else, so this is the GTX 1070, the non-Ti variant. At 1080p medium balance, we get an average of 51 FPS. It's quite a bump, but we're still bottlenecked by the CPU and the memory. And depending where you are on the map or which map, you get between 68 FPS to 34 FPS. It is playable, but it is not optimal. Now for a quick baseline, the Intel variant of the Ryzen 5 1500X should be the Intel i5 4690. So this test is with the i5 4690, which should be the equivalent, but the CPU is pegged at 100%. We are heavily bottlenecked by the CPU. The proposed i7 4790K should be a better choice, but I'm pretty sure it will still be a bottleneck to some level, as you'll see further in this video. So the GTX 1070 with that CPU, it gives me an average of 39 FPS, which is not good. It's playable, but the CPU is a big issue. So to further test, I went back to the AMD side, the Ryzen 5 2600, still at 8GB with the GTX 1070. I want to find out at which CPU we no more a bottleneck. 1080p, medium, balance, we still are at 39 FPS. This CPU is still our bottleneck, and apparently the bottleneck for the CPU gives you 39 FPS. The RAM is also pegged. We are maxing out at 7.6 and a few meg free for Windows to run in the background. And just to have a baseline, if the Ryzen 5 2600 was the proposed minimum requirement with the GTX 1050 Ti, which is the minimum requirement, and drop the preset settings at low, because that's what I expect if you're playing at the minimum requirement, we get an average of 38 FPS. It's playable, not optimal again, and doesn't look so good. There's a big visual quality drop when you go from medium to low. And to set up the final baseline, 8GB versus 16GB. So I went with the i3 10100F with 8GB and the GTX at 1070, having the memory only as the bottleneck. So the maximum memory is reached, and we have an average FPS of 46 with medium settings at 1080p. And now just adding 8GB for a total of 16, we can see the memory usage went from 7.3, which was max out, to 10.4GB of usage. That helped a lot in so many ways, as now we have 80 FPS on average, and we have the CPU averaging 80, 90, 95% of usage. So now the GPU is doing something. The CPU is almost a bottleneck within the 70 to 80 of usage. I didn't try any 9, 8, 7 or 6 gen of Intel, because the only one I have is the i5 6500, which is a office CPU. I don't have any other 6th gen CPU, and I don't have a 7, 8 or 9. And for the 10th gen, I only have the i3 10100F. But it does the job. On the teeth, but it still does the job. So from there, the i3 10100F and 16GB of RAM, let's going down the path of GPU to see which one can play the game on an acceptable FPS. So we're going down from the GTX at 1070 to the GTX at 1060 6GB. And at 1080p, medium and balance, we get an average of 56 FPS. This is highly playable. It's a good choice. So if you still have this GPU, you can play Helldiver. Hopefully you have a better CPU than the 4th or 6th gen Intel, or the 1st or 2nd gen of Ryzen. A quick note on the 1060 6GB, if you drop the settings to low preset, you're going to have an average of 72 FPS at 1080p. So if you're more of a FPS kind of guy instead of a visual quality, you can drop the settings to have a bit more FPS to play with. If you're playing with the GTX 1050 Ti, the proposed minimum requirement card, which makes no sense to play with the 10th gen CPU, but let's say that you still have it, your low settings will give you 62 FPS and the medium settings will give you 29 FPS. FPS. It's playable, doesn't make sense with that CPU, but it's playable. But there's probably some i5 or i7 from the 6, 7, 8 or 9 gen that will do the job perfectly with the GTX 1050 Ti. Then going a bit older, like the GTX 970, which should be a bit better than the GTX 1050 Ti, we get an average of 34 FPS at medium settings and 67 at low settings. So my guess is i7 with the 6th gen with the GTX 970 should be a nice budget setups to play Helldiver. For the AMD side of things, I went first with the RX 570 4GB variant. This I need to play at 1080p low settings to reach a 50 FPS. It was unplayable at medium, being sub 20s. Using more than 10GB of RAM, the CPU was not peg at all, but the GPU was at 100% to 99% of utilization. So if you still have a RX 570, don't expect too much. It will be at low settings and sub 50s FPS. After that, still in AMD side, the RX 480 8GB variant. This didn't make much a difference, the 8 or the 4, because we're barely using 3.5, 3.7GB of VRAM. So if you have either of the 4 or 8GB, you will get the same result. Medium, 1080p, balance, 52 FPS. The GPU utilization was at 100% most of the time. So more VRAM or less won't make a difference in this case. To finish this testing, I went with the RX 460. At low settings, balance, 1080p, we have a 33 FPS. So if your goal is to play at 1080p and over 30 FPS, this is your winner card. For the RAM, I would say 16GB, it should be the winner, not 8. And for what the CPU should be the winner, I have absolutely no idea, because the one they propose is definitely not. The one I'm currently using is not the best choice, and there's probably the 6, 7, 8, 9 gen better CPU of all the platform. Also go for the AMD side, so Ryzen 300 series, 3000, maybe some Ryzen 7 second gen, like the Ryzen 7 2700. So the winner for low settings will be the RX 460 with 16GB. For the 60 FPS at low settings should be the GTX 1050 Ti. For medium settings at 30 FPS will be the GTX 970. And for 60 FPS at medium settings, if you tweak a little bit the settings, should be the 1066GB. I'll try to acquire more hardware to do more precise testing. But for now, thanks for having come watching and see you on the next one. And subscribe.